Now, I had set myself the task of going through 1 Peter verse by verse. And so I've been proceeding at my own rate. And we stopped last time in chapter 2, in the last paragraph, verses 21 to 25. Let's reiterate our standard stuff at the beginning. Who is writing and choosing the words? Silas is. To whom is Silas, in behalf of Peter, writing? To the Christians in Turkey. Why is he writing to the Christians in Turkey in particular? Because that's where the great majority of Christians were. The vast majority of Christians were living in Turkey. What is the theme of 1 Peter? The sufferings of Christ and the sufferings of Christians in response to the sufferings of Christ. All right? Now then, he is in the middle of addressing a series of groups within the church. He says in 2:11, "Beloved, I beseech you." Verse 13, "Be subject for the Lord's sake." And then he addresses 18, "You household slaves." 2:18, "You household slaves." And he gives them some directions. And then, after having talked about their lot as household slaves, he says, "For you, to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example." I mentioned that that's the word underwriting, hupogrammos, "that you should follow him in his steps. He committed no sin. No guile was found on his lips. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he trusted to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree." I imagine that you have tree in your translation. It's not the Greek word for tree, however. Kulon is cut wood prepared for use. It's lumber. Dendron is a tree growing outside the window. So this gives us something of the wrong idea. He himself bore our sins in his body on the stake, let us say, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. Here's a phrase that sounds very much like Paul. This is not surprising after all. This sort of thing that we see in Ephesians and Galatians and Romans, well, Silas was involved in all those books. So it's not surprising that we would find such a phrase. He himself bore our sins in his body on the stake, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Here he's quoting indirectly from the suffering servant psalm in Isaiah 53. Let me ask again, who chose the proof texts? Who chose the proof texts? Jesus himself chose the proof texts in his ministry. "For you were straying like sheep, but you've now returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." Where did the shepherd image come from? What did Jesus say? "I am the good shepherd." Right? And his constant parables about the sheep, where he cast the Son of Man in the role of shepherd, is where this image comes from. The shepherd and guardian of your souls. Peter's preaching reflects Jesus' preaching. We saw that in Acts 2, Acts 4, Acts 9. We saw that Peter's preaching reflected Jesus' public preaching style. Now, Having said this, under the heading of the suffering of the household slaves, nearly 90% of the Roman world was of the slave class. Now this we can be quite sure of. Nearly 90% of the Roman world was of the slave class. We say, well, Christianity took root among the slaves. It was a religion of the poor. Well, no. No. It was no more a religion of the poor than of the rich. It also took a root in Caesar's household. Were there more Christians who were slaves than Christians who were rich? Yeah, sure. Why? Yes, because 90% of the Roman world was slaves. Of course. He addresses masters and servants as you would expect. Yeah. Now, he turns to another class. Likewise, you wives, be submissive. Like what? What does the likewise refer to here? Likewise, you wives. What? Slaves, yes. He addresses the slaves first as those most likely to be not submissive in this messianic sect that Christianity had become. Likewise, you wives, be submissive to your husbands. I had the privilege of preaching in one of our churches 2 weeks ago and listening to the Sabbath school class, and it was about this passage here. And seeing what the folks would say about this passage. You wives, be submissive to your husbands so that some... Well, it was a very, very interesting experience. The brethren hewed to the meaning of the text. Some of the sistren had to adjust the meaning of the text a little bit for them. None of them knew what the text was about, unfortunately. But it was great to listen to. I just said that 90% of the Roman world was slaves. So, that would mean, I presume then, that a married woman who was a slave was stuck with her husband, right? What do you think? It would seem so, would it not? If that were true, this passage doesn't make much sense. What is Peter telling them to do? Likewise, you wives, be submissive to your husbands, so that some, though they do not obey the word, may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. He's addressing them as if what? Just read the text. He's addressing them as if what? If you tell somebody, listen, I want to counsel you to do this, what's the suggestion there? That they had a choice. Now this is very interesting. Which gospel reflects the teaching of Peter? Mark. Yes, I know you know that. Remember that Peter, as a good, devout Jew, followed rabbinic law. Jesus was asked a question about marriage and divorce. And what did he say?
He said it was not so in the kingdom of heaven, but that God had allowed Moses to offer the pleas of divorce because of their hard-heartedness.
Yes. Yes, Jesus said, well, what does the law say? Jesus said, throwing it back. Well, Moses says in the law that we can divorce. And Jesus said bluntly, oh, because of the hardness of your hearts. Mark 10. Now understand why we're going to Mark. Be clear, you who haven't been with us, whose gospel is Mark? This is Peter's gospel. This is Peter speaking. Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, who was John Mark's assistant and sub-bishop in Mark's old age, when Mark was an old man, tells us that he conversed directly with Mark, and that Mark said that he wrote the gospel after Peter's death, from Peter's preaching. And there's plenty of indication of that. We spent lots of time looking at the indications of that. Notice that there's a parallel to this in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 12. Well, I wonder what Matthew says. Well, Matthew says this. The Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" Now I want you to catch the question in Matthew. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? There's a subtext in the question. There's a presumption in the question. And what is that? What's the assumption in the question? No? Think about it now. They ask it this way. They say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? The assumption is the wife can't divorce, and that is correct. Rabbinic law forbade the wife to divorce the husband. It was not part of Jewish society and law ever. We can say without any doubt that no Jewish woman had ever divorced her husband. Faithful wives, good wives, they'd never divorced their husband. Why? They couldn't. All right. So in Matthew, he answered, "Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So they are no longer two but one." Now this is Jesus answering, and he answers the question about the man. That was the only answer there was. What could a man do about divorce? And he doesn't quote Moses about divorce. He quotes Genesis, prior to Moses. Purpose in creation. They then said to him, bring it up, "Why then did Moses command one," meaning a man, "to get a certificate of divorce and put her away?" What's still going on in this text? What is still going on? The man is doing the divorcing. He said to them, for your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, meaning from creation, it was not so. And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. Well, now, that's interesting. Remember, Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, gives us which Christ? The Gospel of Matthew gives us which Christ? In fact, if I were being correct about it, Matthew doesn't give us Christ at all. What does Matthew give us? The Messiah. What point am I making? Matthew was written to whom and for whom? To the Jews and for the Jews. Yes. Now, I've said on a number of occasions that there's plenty of evidence that this is not the case with Mark. What is Mark? Mark is which Christ? Mark is not the Jewish Messiah at all. Jewish concerns and Jewish background are almost non-existent in Mark. Which Christ do we have in Mark? What? It's more precise than that. You see, in Luke we have the philosopher Christ. We have the Greek Christ in Luke. But in Mark, what do we have? The Roman Christ, the citizen of the empire, the Roman governor, the man who speaks and acts as if he were the Roman emperor, whose words and phrases and attitudes reflect the Roman government, the so-called Roman Christ. In Mark 10, we have this story. And Pharisees came up to him in order to test him, asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? He answered them, what did Moses command you? This is a different reflection of the story. In this story, Jesus assumes that Jews rely on Moses. And so he says, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and put her away. But Jesus said to them, for your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So they are no longer two but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man, meaning Moses and the Jews, put asunder. Then he says, and in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. What is going on here? What's going on here?
In this version, that extra paragraph about the woman divorcing the man was added, whereas in the Matthew it was omitted.
I understand why Matthew omitted it. I have no doubt that Jesus said it, and Matthew never mentions it, and I have no doubt why he doesn't mention it. Why? In Judaism, the thought of a woman divorcing her husband was anathema and would cause outrage. And if any such thing had been said, but, and I've said this so many times, Jesus was not merely a Jew. Where'd you grow up? Let's try it again. Nazareth. And where was Nazareth? What was Nazareth? The suburb of Sepphoris. The town of the engineers who were building the Greco-Roman capital of Galilee. All right?
It's also a town where the army...
The army camp, yes. The Roman army camp. Nazareth was a Roman town, a Greco-Roman town. So much so that an Israelite in whom there was no guile said to himself with some concern, when his good fellow disciple of John the Baptist said, we found the Messiah, and it's Jesus of Nazareth, what did he say? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? It wasn't that Nazareth was nowhere. Off the top of his head, did Nathanael know where Nazareth was? Of course he did. And what would be assumed about Jews who lived in Nazareth? Working for Herod Antipas. Well, if you're working for Herod Antipas, you're already in trouble, and if you're working with Herod Antipas, you're working with Greeks and Romans every day, so what must you be? Unclean, by definition. Anybody who would take such a position, anybody who would involve himself in the Roman government was already suspect from the Pharisees' viewpoint. Now, why does Jesus speak thus in Mark? What does it seem to imply? It seems to imply that in the Roman world, wives could divorce their husbands. What a good steel trap an engineer is like. And the answer is, in Roman law, the answer is, they could. And did. They could, and what if they were slaves? See, I was being nasty here at the beginning. I said if 90% of the Roman world were of the slave class, then it has to be assumed that the women slaves could not and did not divorce their husbands, right? Wrong. Because suppose you had a master. Let's call him Marcus, which after all is a good Roman name. And let us say Marcus has a husband and wife who are his slaves. And let us say that Drusilla has been beaten. Marcus owns Drusilla, and she's part of his household, and part of his goods, and part of his wealth. If her husband is beating her, Marcus has to say to himself, what? This is not a good situation. Drusilla can come to Marcus and say, Master, my husband beats me. I've thought it over, I wish to divorce him. And what could Marcus say? Yeah, I see the problem. Yes, you can. And her husband wouldn't have said much about it, because if the master said, yes, she can divorce you, then what? That was it. So they'd go to the court, they'd file a divorce. After all, you've got to understand that our law is a descendant of Roman law. And that would be that. And that's why Peter's counsel is interesting. See, when you read Peter's counsel, you assumed that the woman had to be submissive to her husband. And you thought Peter was saying to them, look, be nice, good wives, and be submissive to your husbands. You're stuck anyway, so have a good attitude about it. That isn't what Peter was saying. He was saying what? Peter's saying, I know that you could do what? I know that you could do what? You could leave. But what I'm counseling you to do is what? Is stay. He's talking to people who don't have to. That's the key to the text. And what is the motivation for staying? Peter doesn't say stay forever. What does he say? Yes, see if you can win him. That's what he says here. Likewise, you wives, be submissive to your husbands, so that some, though they do not obey the word, may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, when they see your reverent and chaste behavior. Obviously, there were women slaves becoming Christians, and what? And what were they doing? This was causing trouble in the household, and what were they doing? They were divorcing their husbands. And Peter is saying what? Yes, follow Christ's example of suffering and try to stay with them and win them. When they see your reverent and chaste behavior, let not yours be the outward adorning with braiding of hair, decoration of gold, wearing of robes. See, he's not talking to just slave women, is he? He's talking also to wealthy women. Yeah. not the decoration of gold, the wearing of robes, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable jewel of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. A gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. He's using the word for a precious gem. He's talking jewelry here. He's saying the most precious jewel you can buy is what? A gentle, quiet spirit. That's the very precious thing you can own, rather than an expensive jewel. So once the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves and were submissive to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Now we found out an interesting thing about that, didn't we? When we were doing an exegesis of Genesis, we found out that Sarah, as a good Amorite woman, as a sister wife, was what? Was the legal equal of her husband, and could have left him at any time and left him penniless. And you are now her children if you do right and let nothing terrify you. This is interesting. He's talking about a gentle, quiet spirit and not being afraid, not getting afraid. Maybe of the husband, maybe of the situation of being a Christian in the Roman world. Let nothing terrify you. Likewise, you husbands. He's following a series here. Be subject to the Lord, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, he says, in 1:13. That's the key to what he's saying here. That's the opening paragraph of this section. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Then he addresses household slaves, then he addresses wives, and now he's addressing husbands. Live considerately with your wives, bestowing honor on the woman as the weaker vessel, since you are joint heirs of the grace of life, in order that your prayers may not be hindered. This is also a good Roman viewpoint too. That a man who doesn't take care of his household can't pray to his gods. Why? The Romans held that if you weren't good to your household, the gods what? Would not hear you. Yes, family values, okay. Yeah, that's good. Live considerately with your wives, bestowing honor on the woman as the weaker sex. The weaker vessel, it actually says. So you are joint heirs of the grace of life, in order that your prayers may not be hindered. Of course, it was easier to speak in terms of equality between men and women in the Roman world, where the equality was legal and automatic. Most of these Christians in Turkey weren't of Jewish background, were they? This whole passage is foreign to the Jewish way of thinking. In Judaism, you wouldn't have had to give this counsel. There was a foregone conclusion. The husband was absolute master. The wife would be submissive, period. Okay. Now that's an important matter. This is a good example of doing an exegesis of a text. You have to know the background or you're going to go down the wrong road. And I listened to the folks in Connecticut busily going down the wrong road. The women were trying to get some equality in this text, and the men were saying it says what it says. But none of them knew what it said. And since I had to speak the next hour, I did not wish to involve myself in this controversy. Okay. Finally, all of you. He's still in that section. 2:11, Beloved, I beseech you, be subject for the Lord's sake. 2:13. And now he's saying, servants, wives, husbands, finally all of you, have unity of spirit, sympathy, love of the brethren, a tender heart, a humble mind. Do not return evil for evil or reviling for reviling. Look, they were on the verge of the great persecution. They were about to be treated as cruelly as anybody had ever been treated. Many people, myself included, would have what reaction? You want to beat me, wear me down, take everything away from me because I'm a Christian? What would be the normal human reaction? To fight back. And these Greco-Roman religions were a dime a dozen. And that's exactly what they did. Peter knew that there were elements there who had the natural desire to fight back, and that the persecution could bring that out. And of course, if the Roman authorities found that the Christians were fighting back, what would it drive them to do? Be all the more cruel, right? Peter, in writing on the sufferings of Christ, is preparing the church for its time of trouble by pointing to the example of Jesus in his time of trouble. They were already experiencing persecution for being Christians, and now it was about to become an organized, empire-wide persecution. And Peter has that in mind as he addresses them. By the way, what persecution did they understand this to be? This was what that was coming up here? The Great Tribulation that preceded the end of the world. Do not return evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary bless, for to this you have been called. He keeps saying that. This suffering that you're going to experience, you've been called to. It's your destiny. He keeps saying that over and over again. For he that would love life and seek good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Let him turn away from evil and do right. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Why does he quote this long passage from Psalm 34? Because it was a Christian hymn. They sang it. They knew it. It was part of their culture, if you please. These passages of songs in the New Testament are songs that people sang. They recognized it. This is something they could sing around the house. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is right? But even if you do suffer for righteousness' sake. Here's a passage from reminiscent of something Jesus said. Even if you do suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, reverence Christ as Lord. Who saw all the sufferings of Christ? Speaking of his last sufferings, we said that Christ's sufferings were lifelong. But who saw the final sufferings of Christ? Who saw all the sufferings of Christ? The disciples, you say. Oh, I wish that were true, but it's not true. Peter and John. They all forsook him and fled, quoting it. But Peter, the disciple whom Jesus loved, followed from a distance, it says. The others went. 2 followed. Peter and John followed how long? At a distance. How long? Where'd they go? Well, they went to Caiaphas' palace, right? And to Pilate in the Tower of Antonia, and then to Herod Antipas's palace that he inherited from Daddy, up on the top of the ridge of the western hill, and then back to the Tower of Antonia to Pilate, and then on the Via Dolorosa to outside Golgotha, outside the western gates. Peter was one of two people who had seen all the sufferings of Christ, from beginning to end. Right after the leaving Caiaphas' house, the woman said, "No, but you were one of them." It says he went out and wept when the cock crowed. But we see him next in Mark at the judgment hall. He didn't then say, "Well, I'm just going to give up here." Wasn't his personality anyway. Even if you do suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts reverence Christ as Lord, because Christ suffered in a certain way. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you. This is another Roman legal term. What's an apologia? What's Peter saying here? What's an apologia? Oh, I know the word apologize develops from it, but it doesn't have the sense of the English word apology at all. Yeah, when Tertullian wrote to the emperor the apology for the Christians, he wasn't saying "I'm sorry," he was saying what? Yes. The Christian bishop Tertullian had the nerve to sue the emperor for persecuting Christians. He was a lawyer, and so he sued the emperor for persecuting Christians. And he made an apologia in behalf of Christians. It's long and detailed. It's a wonderful source of information on early Christianity. And it's really worth reading. If you haven't ever read Tertullian's Apology in Defense of Christianity, then it's something worth doing. You've missed something great in the history of the world. He made a formal defense. Peter's saying, be prepared to make a formal defense of what you hold. Where would such an apologia be made? In a court. At this point, Christianity was no longer legal. It was legal as long as it was part of the Jewish religion. But very early on, the Jews themselves made it clear to the Roman authorities that Christianity was not Judaism. Okay? So it was an illegal religion. Where and how did Christianity first become legal? Does anybody know? Oh, that's how it eventually became legal. How did it first become legal?
Wasn't it legal just as a sect as Judaism?
Yes, but they had already determined that it was not part of Judaism. That's what was going on in the 50s when they were following Paul around, to make sure that the Roman authorities knew that this wasn't part of Judaism. Where and how did it first become legal? Oh, the Roman Christians set the pattern. They bought outside the city, in common, since they held their wealth in common, they bought, out in the western hills, a Roman graveyard. Now, graveyard societies owned the graveyards legally. So they organized the Christian Graveyard Society. They registered themselves. And that's why today, when we go to Rome, what do? We go out to look at the catacombs. They're not outside the city now because the city's much bigger, but they were then. And this is why the Christians had those great big round rooms in the catacombs to hold their services. It wasn't that they were driven underground by persecution, but what? It was perfectly appropriate and perfectly legal for the owners of the graveyard to do what? To meet and discuss the business of the graveyard society. And so Christians regularly met in the catacombs, not to hide, but what? To do it legally. Only Roman Christians would think of that, right? To Romans, law and legality was a big deal. So if that's a big thing, then what? Then if we're going to be persecuted, we don't want it said that our meetings and so forth were illegal, so what? So already in the first century, they were meeting legally in their graveyard. Maybe not the nicest atmosphere for a church, but after all, memento mori, remember death. It reminded you of the need for salvation if you met every week where? Among your tombs. And the Christians were nice about it, and they followed the legal civilities. They did bury pagans in their graveyard in a certain section, because after all, if you're going to have a legal graveyard society, then what? You're going to have to bury anybody who comes, and they even made money. Yeah. So the catacombs aren't quite maybe what you thought they were. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence, and keep your conscience clear, so that when you are abused, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing right, if that should be God's will, than for doing wrong. For Christ also suffered for sins, once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, indeed being put to death in flesh, but made alive in spirit, in which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a clear conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers subjected to him. This is an interesting text. Anybody have any questions? If there are no questions, we'll go right on. Anybody have any questions? Somebody ought to have a question. This parallel between baptism and Noah's flood comes right out of the origin of baptism in the Essene sect. The Essenes compared baptism to Noah's flood. Obviously, John the Baptist did. Jesus' disciples baptized with John first. Then the disciples baptized even during Jesus' ministry. Jesus' own disciples baptized, and baptism as a correspondence to the flood is right out of the Essene background, right at the origin of baptism. But I don't think that's where the question lies. Yes, the point of what he's saying is that baptism corresponds to the flood. That's not quite where the question is in the text. Does anybody have a question? The spirits in prison. Well, when were they in prison? When does he say they were in prison? If you just read the sentence as it's written, it doesn't give you a problem. But if you don't read it as written, it could give you a problem. When were the spirits imprisoned? Yes, when they were still alive. This use of spirit for persons is common in the New Testament because it's the standard way that they refer to individuals. We find it translated persons in a number of passages in Paul. It's sometimes translated souls, sometimes spirits, sometimes persons. Right? When they were in prison, when they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. Christ preached beforehand the gospel in the Spirit already in the days of Noah. at the time of the first baptism. When was the first baptism, according to Peter? Well, he's using again the Essene theology of baptism. When was the first baptism? In the time of Noah, in which some repented and most did not. And at that time, when the ark was preparing, Christ preached to them in spirit. He was raised in spirit, crucified in flesh, raised in spirit. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, indeed being put to death in flesh, cross out the thus, he's talking about categories here, put to death in flesh but made alive in spirit, in which also, the also is important, and it's not in the RSV, and I know why it's not in the RSV, because the RSV doesn't want it also there. Is it in the text? Yeah, it's in the text. The Revised Standard Version translators believed what? Believed the text taught what? Can you say the Nicene Creed? Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, descended into hell, resurrected the third day, and now stands at the right hand of God. Right? That's the Nicene Creed. That's what the bishop said in the 4th century. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, descended into hell, was resurrected the third day. The so-called Apostles' Creed. It's the Nicene Creed. It has nothing to do with the Apostles. It was 400 years later. But the point is that by that time, the church as a whole could say that what had happened to Jesus after the crucifixion, after his death. He went to hell, where he did what, according to this interpretation of the passage? He preached to the spirits. This gives us a problem, because, of course, the whole issue was the immortality of the soul versus the resurrection from the dead. That was the issue between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees believed in what? The Sadducees believed in what? The immortality of the soul, after the Greek manner, and the Pharisees believed in the bodily resurrection from the dead, with the gap of unconsciousness in there. Jesus sided thoroughly with the Pharisees against the Sadducees and taught the bodily resurrection from the dead. Now, it was a given that if you believed in the bodily resurrection, you believed what happened to a man when he died. What was his case 30 minutes after he died? He was what? He was asleep. What did he know? Nothing. When would he know something again? In the resurrection. Right? Now, of course, this is really, really, really what made the House of Cathros decide, the chief priests decide, that they had to get rid of Jesus. They were the leaders of the Sadducean sect, and Jesus did something that caused them to decide that they had to make their move, and they had to do it now while he was there for the feast. And what was it? The resurrection of Lazarus, because the bodily resurrection was now proven. Okay? The early Christians believed in the bodily resurrection. They accepted the idea that the Pharisees taught and rejected the idea of the Sadducees for an obvious reason. Why did Christians reject immortality of the soul and believe in bodily resurrection? Why? Because the whole religion was based on what? The bodily resurrection of Christ. By definition, they accepted the teaching of the bodily resurrection. So no Christian believed that Jesus was conscious after his death. Besides which, those who do teach this have a bit of a problem. Okay? And this is standard doctrine. I mean, if you have to press a Protestant really hard on this issue, Catholicism doesn't have a problem with this. If you press a Roman Catholic teacher, where was Jesus between his death and resurrection? He'll tell you he went to purgatory and preached to the imprisoned spirits. He knows that that's what he's teaching. You take a Protestant who's recited the Nicene Creed and you ask him, what does it mean he descended into hell? What happened to him between his death and resurrection? He may be shocked, but his church's teaching is that Jesus was in hell. Why can't a Protestant say purgatory? Can't get purgatory out of the canonical books of the Protestant canon. Okay? He doesn't have Second Maccabees to tell him about purgatory, so being a Protestant, he can't say purgatory. What does he have to say? Hell. Okay? Now, of course, those same people will tell you that Jesus told the thief on the cross what? You'll be with me in paradise today. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I tell you, this is a matter of punctuation now, and it really is a matter of punctuation. I tell you what, today you'll be with me in paradise. Now you have the person on the horns of a dilemma. Since he absolutely interprets the phrase to mean that Jesus promised the thief to be with him that day in paradise, and since it's assumed that good people go to heaven after death, then you have Jesus going to paradise and also what? To hell. And, I wouldn't counsel the glee that one can feel at taking a theology teacher and getting him to this point and saying, now what? But I've had that experience, yes. If you read the text straightforward with the presumption of all Christianity in the bodily resurrection, and what kind of a body is it? This was something that got the Pharisees going, because the Sadducees would always say, well, are you going to get a cold? You have a body, you're going to get a cold. Are you going to go to the bathroom? What about the 7 brothers and the 1 wife? That was their favorite example, right? So when the Sadducees were philosophical and bent, they explored these questions to their minutest detail. So when they heard bodily resurrection, what did they hear? They heard a cough, pimples, boils, going to the bathroom, marrying the wife. And they asked the Pharisees these questions. And then there'd be long arguments. But you see, Jesus didn't involve himself in any of those arguments. What did he say? Well, you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. I mean, he would not even involve himself in that discussion. Okay? But Paul said, because he had to involve himself in that discussion, when it goes into the ground, it's sown a physical body. He's using the image of a plant here. It's sown a physical body, but what? It's reaped as a spiritual body. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. He tells us that. He had been a devout Pharisee. He tells us that. And what was his answer? He said it's a body, all right, but what? It's a spiritual body. It's not the same in makeup. It's not identical in makeup as our vile body. He says this vile body, this carnal nature, which sins by nature automatically, which is selfish, is not the body of the resurrection. That was the teaching of the Christians. There was a bodily resurrection, but not the same body. Yes, this corruptible puts on incorruption. Yes. This vile body must be changed. And that was his point in saying that those who were still alive would be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. the question would automatically come, well, those who are still alive at Christ's coming then, the others may come up a spiritual body, but those who are still standing there still have what? They still got their old body. And that was Paul's point in saying they'll be changed into a different body. If you read the Gospels, you will discover that the Gospels give you a picture of Jesus' spiritual body in the resurrection. Well, why do I say that? They emphasize the spiritual body. Why? He came through the locked doors and so forth. It was, and they make that point while also making that you got to put your finger in the open wound. It's a real body, but it's a spiritual body. Well, what does that mean? It means it's different from something we have now. Describe exactly what it's like. I can't. All right. Now the first baptism. Jesus has now gone into heaven, is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers, the different levels of the universe, in the Roman world, subjected to him. Angels, authorities, and powers, the multi-layered cosmos of the Roman world. Jews wouldn't know. Now what are you talking about? It's not addressing Jews. It's addressing people from a Greco-Roman background. Talking about the death and resurrection of Jesus, the spiritual body, as what Christians facing this persecution have to look forward to. Okay? I have a lot more to say. Thank you very much.